This is The Metro on 1019 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham. What does psychology say about who cheats and why they do it? Todd Shackelford is an evolutionary psychologist from Oakland University. He spoke with The Metro's Carey Jr. II about how and why infidelity happens.
Okay, Professor Shackelford, you think a lot about psychology, relationships. When I say infidelity, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, it's certainly the number one reason that couples come into therapy, for example. It's also the number one cause of men seeking divorce from their partners, and it's the number 2 or 3 cause for women seeking divorce from their partners. So it is arguably the most conflictual issue or concern in any long-term relationship.
How common is infidelity among people today?
Asking people to self-report infidelity is, in fact, that it's the number one reason that people refuse to answer the rest of the questions, and it's also the number one question that's skipped. If you give them the opportunity to skip questions. But what we find is about 25% of women, married women, are unfaithful to their husbands at some point in the marriage, and a slightly larger or higher percentage of men, about 30% of men, are unfaithful to their wife at some point in the marriage. So one way to read that is, man, that's a lot of people being unfaithful. On the other hand, that's a lot of people not being unfaithful. What it means is that about 75% of women are never unfaithful to their husband at any point in the marriage, and about 70% of men are never unfaithful to their wives at any point in the marriage. So the large majority of men and women are faithful to their spouses for the duration of their marriage. That's sort of one way to look at the glass half full rather than half empty.
Okay, so now I want to define infidelity. Can you define it for me? And is there an objective definition?
I'll preface my answer by noting that until about 15 or 20 years ago, infidelity was assessed in the psychology literature by simply asking, has your partner ever been unfaithful? And when you do it like that, very generally, and if you don't explicitly define what you mean by unfaithful, then you find that men and women are equally upset and equally distressed by a partner's infidelity. However, evolutionary psychologists working in the late 1970s, early 1980s suggested that men and women might actually see or interpret infidelity differently. There might be some aspects of infidelity that are more upsetting for men and others that are more upsetting for women. Evolutionary psychologists hypothesized that men would be especially upset by a partner's sexual infidelity, which would place them at risk of what's known as cuckoldry, or investing in another man's offspring.
Right.
On the other hand, women, of course, are always certain of their maternity. Evolutionary psychologists hypothesized and found that women are more upset by a partner's emotional infidelity, investing time, effort, resources into another woman, into another woman's kids, for example. While both men and women are upset by a partner's sexual and emotional infidelity, if you ask them to tell you which aspect would be worse, men consistently report that it's the sexual aspect, women that it's the emotional aspect.
So how does this play out with same-sex couples?
The short answer is we don't know as much. What we can say is that same-sex relationships mirror much of what we see in heterosexual relationships. So in male same-sex relationships, we do find that men in same-sex relationships are more upset by a partner's sexual infidelity than by a partner's emotional infidelity. Conversely, when you look at female same-sex relationships, women in those relationships are, much like heterosexual women, more upset about a partner's emotional infidelity than by a partner's sexual infidelity. So it's as if it's the same basic psychology that's operating in the male, in the heterosexual male, for the homosexual male. But of course, the target of sexual interest is different.
So what influences people to step out on their partners? What causes infidelity?
What we know, I could talk a little bit about some of the personality predictors, but ultimately, the very best predictor of men's likelihood of pursuing an infidelity is sheer opportunity. So when the opportunity presents itself, that is the time when men are most likely to pursue it. From a woman's perspective, opportunity really doesn't figure into the situation, at least not as prominently as it does for men. For women, what is the best predictor of her likelihood of pursuing infidelity is her relationship satisfaction. how satisfied she is with her current relationship, and particularly how emotionally satisfied. The extent to which she feels, that she's in love with and that he's in love with her. I don't mean to suggest that there aren't women who do fantasize explicitly and only about sex. There certainly are such women, but what I'm talking about are broad sex differences on average. Things look very similar across homosexual and heterosexual relationships with regard to the predictors and consequences of infidelity.
For both men and for women.
That's right. That's right.
So we've just been talking about kind of predictable circumstances that help us understand how likely infidelity is to occur. I want to know now about just people's personalities. Are there personalities that help us identify when it's more likely to happen?
Once you get past the basic finding of opportunity for men and relationship dissatisfaction for women as predictors of infidelity, you can still ask, okay, but what about those men that do have an opportunity? Many don't. In fact, most don't. Why not? And what about those that do? Is there something that differentiates those men? And then on the other side, those women that do versus those that don't. And the answer is yes. Personality traits are also good predictors of infidelity. The best established model for personality sort of thinks about human personality in 5 major dimensions. They're called the so-called Big Five.
Mm-hmm.
And it spells out ocean. So it's O, openness to experience. C is conscientiousness. E is extroversion or outgoingness. A is agreeableness, and N is neuroticism. So those 5 dimensions basically cover, with that in mind, men and women who score high on the dimension of openness to experience, perhaps not surprisingly, are more likely to be unfaithful when presented with the opportunity than are those who score low on openness to experience. Also, the dimension of conscientiousness. So men and women who are more conscientious, that is, who are more likely to follow rules, who are more likely to be dependable and reliable, they're less likely to be unfaithful. So openness and conscientiousness are both very, good predictors, individual difference or personality trait predictors of infidelity. And there's some work that suggests that what's called neuroticism, it's the opposite side of emotional stability. So people who are more anxious, more neurotic, they also appear to be somewhat more likely to be unfaithful, both men and women. So here we don't see the sorts of sex differences that we've previously talked about. These are personality traits that do seem to reliably predict the pursuit of infidelity by both men and women.
All the people we've been discussing they're married couples particularly who are reporting that they cheated, right? Not just people who are in relationships.
I mean, most of the work that I was telling you about relies on people who are in marital relationships, but much of this applies.
Okay.
So long as people are reporting that they're in a committed, sexually exclusive relationship. That's what we ask for. And actually, when we do this research, they have to have been involved in this kind of relationship for at least 6 months.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, on average, they're involved longer than that, and probably half of them are married, and the other half are not married.
You're listening to The Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II. My guest is Professor Todd Shackelford. He is an evolutionary psychologist from Oakland University. We're talking about infidelity, where it comes from, why it happens, and how we can identify it in our lives. Okay, Professor Shackelford, what about non-traditional or non-monogamous relationships? These are folks who may be in open relationships or they're in polyamorous relationships. They're dating more than one person at once. How does it play out in that arena? Definitely.
I mean, what it means is that what counts, it depends on how you want to study this, but what counts as a formal infidelity is something that happens outside of the agreement. So, I mean, typically there's a lot of time and effort invested in developing an agreement about, the three of us. How are we going to do this? And it's not an infidelity if one person has sex or has emotional feelings for one of the partners in a relationship or both. Okay, but if you're moving outside of that polyamorous or unit, now it's infidelity. Or if you do something outside the relationship without getting the explicit consent of the partners, then it qualifies as an infidelity. I'll also, say that despite these sometimes very involved agreements, polyamorous relationships are notoriously unstable. They're very difficult to maintain, in part because people get very jealous. Even though they've all three agreed, let's say there's 3 people, they've all agreed that it's okay have emotional feelings and to have sex with this other person in the relationship. Well, turns out that when it actually happens, that, somebody doesn't appreciate that, the other person that was left out.
Mm-hmm.
And so then there are feelings of conflict and jealousy. And so it's not as if making this agreement somehow wipes away, 1 million or 2 million years of evolutionary history.
Okay. So now I want to know, because we've been talking a lot of numbers, really how applicable this information really is. What can I actually take away from this to be a little bit more aware and understanding in my daily life?
Well, I guess it depends on your interests. I mean, for example, there are, many clinical psychologists, apply a lot of this work in their own dealings with, in their own treatment of couples. Clinical psychologists and counseling psychologists tell us that, the number one reason that they talk to couples is because one or the other thinks that one or the other is unfaithful.
Mm-hmm.
So we know it's a point of contention. We know it's a point of conflict. But we also know that couples can talk about these things, and they can be encouraged to assess their concerns about infidelity, to, what is it that led you to believe that this is true? So if it's not confirmed infidelity, I mean, a lot of times couples will come to therapy because the man, for example, is sexually jealous. He's jealous, and he's controlling, and it's driving her up the wall. And so the therapist can talk to both members of the couple about male sexual jealousy, for example. And this is one take on it, is there's nothing, you're not mentally sick or mentally ill. Your evolved psychology is operating as it was designed to operate, but that doesn't mean we should therefore allow it to operate.
Mm-hmm.
We can actually grab a hold of it, and we can assess, okay, let's be rational about this. Let's talk about this. And what led you to believe that your partner was being unfaithful? And oftentimes, from men's perspective, particularly men who are in the throes of sexual jealousy, all sorts of bizarre cues that they're picking up on. It's almost like they're trigger happy
Mm-hmm.
with assuming she's being unfaithful.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but that's something that a therapist can help men grab a hold of. And particularly cognitive behavioral therapy seems to be particularly successful. Jumping to conclusions based on one glance or, one telephone ring. And then for some men, that's it, she's cheating. And that's not a normal, healthy reaction. And so therapists can work with clients, to appreciate that that's not normal, and it's something that we can talk about. And so, anyways, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I do know that they are working with these things.
I mean, it sounds like a lot of this is for clinicians to really understand, and then they kind of do the work with their clients to make sure that they cater the proper consultation to that client's individual circumstance.
I mean, it is. That's how I think about it. On the other hand, as you were speaking, I was just thinking about, if you go to any major bookstore, if you just go to Amazon online, you see there are major sections on self-help for relationships, and so there are books about, why is my partner so jealous? Or why does she always want to go out?
Sure.
Or something like that. In other words, it's an effort to reach, the general public, and helping the general public understand why their relationships are working the way they're working or not. And so I think, there's certainly an opportunity to reach a much broader audience. And sometimes, bringing in the evolutionary stuff for many people can be particularly enlightening.
Okay. They're fueled by or informed by a lot of these numbers.
Definitely.
And they're a way to help people self-facilitate their way through some of the tense moments of their relationship.
Absolutely. And
I see.
Yeah, while also encouraging, couples to, of course, consider the possibility of seeking professional therapy. But in the meantime, here's what we can say about some of the normal ebbs and flows and conflicts that do occur in relationships. And most people read these books and think, yep, that's in mine too, and mine too. And so a lot of people see themselves in, these are normal areas of conflict.
Todd Shackelford is an evolutionary psychologist from Oakland University. That's it for The Metro. The Metro is hosted by Robin Vincent and me, Tia Graham. It's produced by Sam Corey and Kerry Jr. II. Our engineer is Jose Yanis, and our senior producer is David Lyons. You ever want to hear a podcast that you didn't get to hear live? You can go on to wdet.org/metro, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube to listen to those conversations. The Metro is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. And this is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. You all have a great day.